Hi, it's Connor Engel back with another topic analysis, this time on the November-December topic, the United States ought to provide a federal jobs guarantee. Today we'll be taking a philosophical perspective on the topic, discussing different frameworks you can read for different positions, including social contract theory, international law, utilitarianism, and objectivism. Each section will cover the general thesis of the philosophical position, as well as go over some topic arguments that can be applied to the position for AFs and negs you might want to write. So the first we'll go over is social contract theory, which is embodied by the writings of philosopher John Locke. Locke's thesis begins with the state of nature, which is the thought that in a world without a government, there would be constant disputes over resources and territory between humans, a world in which there would be massive rights violations because the weak would just rule over the strong, given that there's no intervening body to mediate between people and protect the weak from the strong. Um, from the state of nature, Locke believes we precipitate a few natural rights, rights that all people inherently deserve that must be protected by the government. The first is the right to life, that the state of nature is defined by violence and death, and the government's primary purpose is to protect people from these fundamental impositions on their life. The second is the right to property, that the fundamental difference between the person living in the state of nature and the person living in society is that the societal person has access to property that is protected by a government structure and unable to be co-opted by others. This is not mentioned in the slide, but there is also a final right to liberty, which is a freedom of non-contradiction, the right for you to act freely insofar as your freedom does not contradict with the freedom of others and does not undermine the overall structure of the government that is meant to protect this freedom. Now, the social contract is, as the word implies, sort of an agreement between citizens living in a government. It is tacit, which is to say it is not like written anywhere. There's no document that the United States government has that defines what the social contract is, but it's essentially the sort of collective social sentiment we have that we exchange our rights to impose our will upon others in exchange for protection from others doing the same to us, right? That we sort of concede to all abide by the rules and laws of a society. We give them certain rights, right? I no longer have the right to not pay taxes or the right to get out of jury duty, but I concede certain rights in order to receive legal protection from the government, perhaps physical protection, economic protection to a certain extent. And the social contract can also, if you think, extend to a certain social candor that we take with other people, that as a citizen of the same government, we generally assume that we are not out to get each other's resources. So there's a sense of civility amongst citizens that underlies the social contract. Now, this also grants the government its legitimacy, right? In order to uphold the social contract, citizens have to have some say in the way that the government operates, some input. They have to willingly cede their power to the government in order for the government to have legitimate control over them. Now, this usually takes the form of some sort of democratic process, but you can think of a world in which citizens simply give up their rights to a sovereign government, like in a Hobbesian world, but the government doesn't necessarily act through democratic processes. Now let's talk about some topic arguments. Locke, I think, can only really be applied to the affirmative on this topic, given that the affirmative is going to propose that there is a sort of right to federal employment. And I believe it is that right that Locke would say can be considered a natural right that the government ought to protect. So the first argument is that employment is a form of property rights. Remember that property was one of the three natural laws that Locke believed the government ought to grant you. So the idea being that employment is necessary to gain and preserve property. So while the two rights aren't literally the same thing, we wouldn't necessarily think of a job as a literal form of property. It is so intimately tied to the possession and maintenance of property that we can think of it as perfectly instrumental, which is to say, necessary for. In essence, being able to have property, especially when you consider a system that taxes you for property or that requires upkeep or maintenance for property, even just owning property requires a source of income, which is garnered from employment. So it thus becomes what we call a near right. A right that is not literally a natural right, but a right that is so fundamental to a natural right that it ought to be respected in a very similar fashion. So we can also think of an employment as a positive right. What I mean by it not being literally the same natural right is that it does not mean that it is a right of non-contradiction, which is to say that it would not be morally wrong to fire someone just because they have the right to be employed. It is morally wrong to fully deny them gainful employment. You cannot deny a person employment of any sort, but firing them would not be a violation of their rights, as they do not have a right to never be fired or a right to always be employed. They just have a right to be given employment. And if they mess it up, I think that you certainly do have a right to fire them. However, they could still hypothetically, request a new job. So secondarily, employment is instrumental to avoid the state of nature. We can think of this as paralleled to the right to life that we had discussed in the earlier slide, that one cannot live without employment because money is required, for all necessities in a modern society. So thus employment becomes, in another sense, a near right, that it is not literally the same as life, right? Your job is not the same as your life, but insofar as having a job is sort of instrumental to providing the things that make your life possible, we should think that employment is a near right akin to the right to life. Next, we'll begin with a discussion of international law. The general thesis of international law, and this will also be an affirmative position, is that the law ought to be ethical. Right? The purpose of the law should be to dictate how a country can make ethical and legal decisions rather than pragmatic legal decisions. Specifically, international law is meant to provide a universal standard of morality that is enforced through legal regulation. There's a bit of a semantics game being played here, but essentially what I want everyone to intuit is that international law isn't just a question of which law has the legal precedent to govern other countries, but rather, is there an ethical system that is also a legal system? And the thought is that most legal systems are inherently just a pragmatic system, right? A system of legality, which is to say, what ought to be considered legal for a certain country's purpose. International law, or at least a sort of philosophical belief in international law, sees it as a way of setting a deliberate or objective moral standard that creates its own sort of binding normative rules by virtue of the fact that it applies to all countries equally, and that it also is, partly a way to govern countries. So this is what we mean when we say the ethicality of the law ought to be internal. That in order for international law to be a real standard for morality, and not just another semantic way or pragmatic way of dictating how laws ought to function, then it has to derive a normative precedent from the import of the law itself, which is to say we must consider something about the law being in and of itself moral, to the fact that it cannot be regulated by an external moral framework, which is to say, we cannot say that we ought to make laws based on utilitarian calculus, or we ought to make laws based on, a Kantian calculus, some subservience to the omnilateral will. We have to think that we can only determine laws by a specific set of international agreed upon frameworks, right? If we were to appeal to these outside moral frameworks, we would lose all binding moral force, as there would be no reason for us to think that the international law itself is moral. It just corresponds to a pre-existing external moral framework. So, because of this, the international law must be collective. That international law, by definition, requires a collective input of numerous countries in order to legitimize it. So, in this case, we're going to be using the United Nations, which is usually the go-to reference for international law, given that it is the singular body with the most possible collective acting countries that would contribute to the precedent set for international law. So now let's talk about the topic arguments. The topic arguments interesting for international law are going to be very different than you would think for most positions, because really the only justifications international law needs, if it is true that international law is inherently moral in and of itself, as well as morally binding, all you would need to do is prove that international law mandates a right to federally guaranteed employment. And in this sense, there is a numerous set of precedents that require that countries provide their populaces with employment. Now, It ought to be noted here that the letter of the law, in most cases, doesn't necessitate that they specifically be federal jobs, only that there be a federal mandate for jobs. Now, in most cases, obviously, this implies some sort of government job, as it would be difficult for the government to intervene and require that a private owner give a job to a certain number of people. So, in most cases, the assumption is that the government is providing the job. But the letter of the law doesn't necessarily say this, so it's important to be ready for perhaps this semantic objection that your opponents might levy at you. I'm not going to delve very deeply into most of these precedents, more so than I think just these first two, which are the ones that will come up most frequently when discussing the international precedent for a right to work or any sort of job mandate. I mean, the first is from one of the fundamental articles the UN has produced, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a general compendium of numerous different human rights that is acknowledged by all members of the UN Assembly, and is just sort of their chartered Bill of Rights. I mean, in Article 23 of this Bill of Rights, they state that everyone has the right to work, have a free choice of employment, and have, justifiably favorable working conditions, as well as a general protection against unemployment. Additionally, there is a literal treaty that has been adopted by the UN General Assembly, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, in which they establish that a right to work is essential for all forms of human rights. It's an inseparable and inherent part of human dignity. This is good because the language here is very strong. It makes it so that a right to work is not just a fundamental human right, but a prerequisite to multiple human rights, which gives us good ground to weigh on, rights frameworks or virtue frameworks. The Articles 7 and 8 are sort of a companion to that, and they flesh out just the specific dimensions of how this right ought to break down. And as you can see, there are numerous other articles and regional charters that establish the right to work for different countries. This isn't, this hardly scratches the surface, I think, of how much you could really delve into the articles which outline a right to work. There are many more I have not mentioned in this slide because I think it would be fruitless to, and they all essentially say the same thing. But essentially, there's just much precedent that almost every country in the world who is engaged in a collective creation of international law agrees that there ought to be a right to work and that this right is incredibly fundamental. So next we're going to talk about utilitarianism. This is a broad framework that will apply to both the AF and the neg. While I know that this is commonly associated with policy positions, I want to take a second to just investigate the actual underlying framework of utilitarianism so that we can understand it a bit better, more so than just the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. So I want to start off with the general meta-ethic of consequentialism, the idea that the morality of an action is based upon its consequences, right? This is one of the foundational features of utilitarianism, being a consequentialist ethic. That we ought to evaluate the morality of an action based on whether or not it provides a desirable consequence, not what the intent of our actions are. So it defaults to an epistemology of naturalism, which is to say they believe all knowledge we have about the world, all moral knowledge, can only be gained through experience, our understanding of pleasure and pain, our understanding of the world as we interpret it through our senses. This is achieved through a process called phenomenological introspection, which is just a very fancy way of saying reflecting on our own experience. In particular, utilitarian authors tend to discuss an experience of pleasure and pain that is universal in all people. And by understanding others to be like us, we can then intuit that we ought not do pain to them because we understand that by our own metrics, pain is a bad thing. So by understanding others as human, and as you being a human and disliking pain, you can understand that others would dislike pain, which gives you sort of an intuitive burden to not commit painful acts against other people. So when talking about utilitarianism specifically, we must abide by what's called the principle of utility, that we should act as always to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is, the most common phrase you'll hear when referring to utilitarianism, the sort of typical standard it has. Note that this is inherently other regarding, which is to say it requires, the greatest number of people have the greatest good. So this isn't something that you should consider your personal good or happiness as having any relevant factor in more than anybody else's. Now, In terms of what normatively drives you to be good to others, we should think that there is an inherent duty that if we are able to act, right, we have a moral duty to act to minimize harm. The utilitarian, and this is, part of probably the pitfall of utilitarianism, that it has a very significant morally binding duty, that the utilitarian is almost always obligated to act, because there is always a greatest good that can be achieved in any given action. So insofar as there can always be a maximizable good, there is almost always a duty to maximize the good. As a small side note, there is a distinction between act and rule utilitarianism, in which act utilitarians judge an action based on a specific action in particular. And rule utilitarians determine actions via sort of moral rules, which they think will generally affect a good outcome. So the difference being that in deciding whether or not to uh, use a gun for self-defense, an act utilitarian would judge the scenario itself. They would say, okay, well, what exactly is happening to you? Is this person a threat to you? Will shooting them potentially kill them? Will it just maim them? Are they perhaps wearing a bulletproof vest? How easy will it be to defend yourself in other ways, etc.? A rule utilitarian will try and evaluate a broader moral rule, like you ought defend yourself in a position in which your life is threatened, even if it requires lethal force. So in that sense, they would say that there is a general rule they think will generally produce an optimistic outcome that you can use as a guiding sort of norm for any situation you find yourself in. That at the point at which you think your life is threatened, you can use the gun to shoot them because it abides by this general rule that typically will affect the greatest outcome for society writ large. And a very important feature of utilitarianism that comes up in every topic is the government obligation, particularly for this topic as well, as there is a federal mandate implying a government actor. The thought is that a government has to be willing to mediate the wills of its people, which requires some sort of trade-off, right? It has to pluralistically appeal to all of its citizens, which means it has to make decisions in a sort of discerning utilitarian fashion. Otherwise, this sort of ruins the legitimacy of the government. If a government were to just, for example, act only on a external moral norm like the omnilateral will, that might actually lead its constituents to lose faith in it, because it seems like they wouldn't be abiding by the will of the constituency, but by the omnilateral will, by some higher moral decree. In addition, there are lots of issues as to why governments are distinct actors from individual people, and thus have different moral obligations, right? A government is a body of people, which means it has no clear intent. Its singular purpose, by definition, is to act in order to save its people or benefit its constituency, which means it can't simply omit from taking moral decisions, because it has a unique responsibility to make decisions. So even if it decides not to intervene in a situation, that is an active choice it has to make, right? If a bill comes to the floor, you have to actively choose to vote on it or not vote on it. You can't simply abstain in the sense that you don't want to make any judgment whatsoever. So I think that, there's a lot of utilitarian authors that appeal to the specific nature of a government as an actor, that color its moral responsibilities. So in terms of getting into topic arguments, we'll just cover this briefly because y'all can do the research you want as to establishing normally, which side increases the most overall happiness or benefit for the people. I know common arguments for the app is that it aids the economy. You can think it might increase spending because you're giving people more money, decreases spending on welfare, reduces costs of things like insurance because people will be wealthier generally. It eliminates poverty, and it's good for establishing income inequality generally, and reduces crime if you think that crime is just symptomatic of poverty, because it's usually done out of necessity and not willingness or greed. And this reduction in crime also has other benefits for our society, right? It reduces prison, which reduces criminalization, also has a strong racial component. It reduces human rights violations, prison spending, reduces recidivism that distances criminals from society. So I think overall it has a lot of possible goods that can come, as well as reduction in police spending, for example. So in terms of neg arguments, you'll have a lot of the same arguments, just, contradictions on the other side. They're really going to go in hard for the economy. They're really going to say it harms the economy, that it substantially will increase government debt. To give everyone in the country jobs that need it federally would cost on the order of, $500 billion. It would be incredibly expensive. The thought here is that it also crowds out the private sector, that if you're looking at minimum wage federal jobs, would oftentimes have a higher wage than private employers are willing to pay. It means a lot of employees go over to the government sector than they do to the private sector, which the government ends up being the largest employer. That, as a result, also means there's a lot of inflation, right? People are spending more, have more money, but it also means that businesses will just do more poorly. They probably won't have as many workers. There won't be as much incentive to work at a private job as there would for a government job. Now, this would also cut our welfare spending. If you want to talk about equality offense, you can think of people who don't necessarily have the ability to work. They would probably still rely on social welfare programs that would be cut or even entirely eliminated, because the assumption would be that you don't need welfare if you just like have a job that the government is giving you. This would also raise our taxes substantially. The massive increase in government spending would require a massive increase in taxes. And if you just say, well, let's raise taxes for the rich, that could create various economic problems because the taxes for the wealthy would probably be increased substantially. It might also affect all people, right? You might see an increase in flat taxes for all people, or an increase in tax rates just across the board. And this might actually affect negatively some of the families who might already have slightly lower paying jobs that are not in the federal sector. So you might see their taxes go up, but their income isn't going up. And at the same time, inflation is increasing. So the value of their money is decreasing. So it's just a complex picture as to which Americans a federal job mandate would actually help and which it would hurt. It would also, as some people say, enable government corruption, the distribution of specific jobs in specific places. There could be, a lot of money changing hands, which makes it easier to sneak money out of certain budgets, to simply embezzle money from government funds. So that's a floating possibility as well. Next, we'll talk about a specifically negative position, which is combined objectivism and libertarianism. I want to make a sort of caveat to these positions ahead of time that I don't necessarily think either are super strategic on this topic, or in general, I don't think they're particularly compelling positions. I decided to include them in this topic analysis because I can almost guarantee you will hear them during the year, and it's useful to be able to tell you about them and inform the background. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading these positions, as was the case with the Machiavelli position on the last topic. Maybe very specific portions of it. So in general, objectivism refers to the more specific philosophy of a woman known as Ayn Rand, who wrote many influential novels about a new philosophy which emphasized egoism and selfishness as good things and thought that altruism was actively bad. So it was very controversial for the time, and I would say even now. Libertarianism is the sort of more subtle, milder cousin of objectivism, which simply sees things like property rights as individual rights as being incredibly, incredibly important, and insisting, as a sort of reverse of Locke's social contract, that the government's role should be minarchist, which is to say very, very minimal. The government's role should basically just be to protect you from foreign threats. Other than that, all people in a society should, work in their own ways to make society however they would like it to be, but it emphasizes extreme independence, extreme exercise of autonomy. Again, doesn't necessarily say that you ought to violate other people's autonomy. In fact, it would still explicitly forbid it. But, it says that essentially you have no responsibility toward the greater good, that your primary responsibility is toward yourself, and that, we ought to create a system of independence which, perhaps allows for a greater good, but does not require or mandate contribution toward a greater good. So objectivism specifically starts out with a naturalist cosmology, that we think reality is objectively all there is. There is nothing beyond reality. And specifically, the only relevant feature of this reality is its observable features, right? The features we can see and measure. Both follow an epistemology of reason, that in order to understand the world, we can only do so through logic and reason. This is not the pure logic and reason, the a priori logic that Kant introduces, right, where we simply only use the definition of things to understand the world. Ergo, we know no bachelors are married because the definition of a bachelor is an unmarried man. Rather, here they refer to logic and reason as being just like calculations about the world, just general logical inferences about the world that any reasonable person could make. This, as they believe, is instrumental for all action. It's a sort of guiding tool that they have. The meta-ethic of objectivism and libertarianism generally is egoism. Now, this is a bit unfair for libertarianism, right? For objectivism, it is formally egoism, that you have a normative obligation to pursue your own happiness or your various ends, which is to say the things you will, the things you set out for yourself. For libertarianism, their ethic focuses more along individual rights, their thought being that you have a right to a thing like property, you have a right to freedom and bodily integrity, but it doesn't require that you necessarily maximize your own happiness or that you're constantly seeking your happiness, even at the cost of others. For objectivists, as well as libertarians, you are an end in and of yourself. You yourself are good. You have inherent rights invested in you. For objectivists, you ought never sacrifice your ends for the sake of others, right? The concept of altruism itself is incorrect, is bad. It sacrifices you and sacrifices your ends. This does not require you be cruel to other people, but it doesn't necessarily forbid it. The objectivist has no problem denying charity or aid to those in need, because it's not essential for the ends of the objectivist. Same thing for the libertarian, right? The libertarian has no problem refusing a hospital be built in their backyard so long as it obstructs their view. They simply believe not that there's a necessity to cruelty or to coldness or a necessity that we not be benevolent, but rather that our goals and ends should always take priority over that of others, and we should never be compelled to help others or to have our rights violated for the sake of helping others. Now, this, in both cases, gives rise to a system of pure market capitalism. That capitalism is an extension of human free will. It is just a bunch of interactions made by humans. And as a result, any regulation of this system, as we might have now, environmental regulations, worker regulations, product regulations, all these things are a restriction to individual ends. And as a result, we need, our own ability to regulate and run businesses without any possible intervention from the government. Perhaps you think that some intervention is inevitable, like safety regulations. Maybe libertarians would sort of compromise here, objectivists might compromise here, but in general, the overall running and direction of businesses and capitalism generally ought never be impeded by government regulation. Next, there's a sort of concept of self-esteem that runs through libertarian writing, but isn't necessarily a virtue that they espouse so clearly. But it is one that objectivists do. And the thought here is that self-esteem is a necessary virtue, right? It's a prerequisite to being happy. To have self-esteem, to have confidence and faith in yourself is necessary to feel any happiness, which, as we know, is a normative good for objectivists. And it is also necessary to take any action. That if you cannot be sure of yourself, you cannot be sure of any of the actions you take. Thus, you must have the sort of general sense of self-esteem in order to do anything. This is mutually exclusive with care for others. In the objectivist view, caring for others, sacrificing for others, puts the other above you, because it takes resources from you and distributes it to them, therefore ruining your self-esteem, because it implies that there is someone who is just inherently better or more worthy than you. For the libertarian, giving to others, caring for others, is fine. We just shouldn't sacrifice our rights in order to do it. Self-esteem for the objectivist also requires that all things be earned. They think there's an inherent bad to something being given to you that you have not earned, because it ruins your self-esteem as a result of you never having to have worked for it. You have not sacrificed anything for yourself. You have been given something, and as a result, you have not found any value within yourself, your ability to make choices and carry out and fulfill actions. You have simply been coddled by an external person who is imposing something upon you for their ends. Now, property rights here is a very fundamental libertarian position, one that Locke would agree with as well. If you think back to the beginning of this topic analysis, that property is an extension again of the self in many ways, and that there's many logical proofs for this, but it's not sort of worth investigating too heavily exactly what the syllogism of property as being part of the self is. Essentially, you can think that if you invest energy into creating a thing, that thing becomes partly you and partly of nature, because you have imprinted something on it. As a result, it becomes partly yourself, or rather, you have made an investment in it that nobody else has, because you've put your energy and time into it. Therefore, it becomes sort of an extension of you, something that ought not be taken away from you arbitrarily. And this, libertarians believe, one can never be compelled to sacrifice themselves or any part of their property for the sake of others, no matter the general collective good. So the links to the topic are very clear, I think, for a negative position, that in a world in which there's a federal mandate for jobs, we're looking at an altruistic guarantee, right? An inherent guarantee that provides charity to others, which I think Rand would argue, or other objectivists would argue, kills self-esteem as it's a form of unearned charity, and in general would require probably higher taxes, which not only sacrifice your property rights, but also sacrifice your general will or general, belief that you ought not give to others if you're an objectivist. So this is a clear violation of property rights in the form of taxes, particularly, I think, an unreasonable imposition of taxes if you're to argue that there is no inherent right to a thing like employment, or at the very least, no right that must be provided for by the individual. And it would intervene very clearly in the free market, right? We've already talked about how it crowds out business, but it's a huge imposition upon the general sector of businesses that might have a lot of their jobs taken or a lot of their purposes crowded out by a federal bureau, which expands to cover some of the services they offer. So this general intervention in the free market, as well as you can think of general employment as being part of free market regulation, would clearly destroy a free market capitalist system, thus certainly rubbing objectivists the wrong way, and perhaps also angering libertarians for the same reason. So that is it for the topic analysis. Thank you for listening, and hopefully this was helpful.